Selma, Alabama. Selma had convinced Sultan Murad that this was the prince they wanted ruling Wallachia as an Hunyadi and his allies had killed Vlad's family. Murad also assumed that any chance of the young prince defecting to the Hungarians was most likely buried alive with Vlad's older brother. Plus, it was the perfect time to reclaim Wallachia for the Dracul dynasty. For when John Hunyadi and Vladislav marched into Ottoman-held Serbia, Murad had dealt them a shattering defeat outside Kosovo. In fact, the rout was so chaotic that no one even knew if Hunyadi or Vladislav had survived. Seeing his chance, Vlad stormed into Wallachia with a Turkish cavalry force and seized the throne, a dramatic beginning to a powerful and bloody reign. Soon, Vlad would take revenge on the boyars who had betrayed his father and brother, and would carve a swath across all of the land of— Oops, sorry. Funny story, Vladislav actually turned up, both very alive and with an army, recaptured the throne, and sent Vlad back into exile. His first reign lasted all of 2 months. At first, he fled back to the Ottomans, but things weren't safe there either. Vladislav, though he'd accepted Hunyadi's help to be installed on the throne of Wallachia under the explicit agreement that he'd fight the Turks, was discovering the same thing Vlad's father had. Wallachia simply couldn't survive against the Ottomans without Hungarian aid, and Hungary was a mess. Soon Wallachian boyars pressured him to make peace with the Sultan. So he sent envoys to Sultan Murad looking to strike peace, and Vlad, rightly worried his death might be a condition, bargained, led him over. And Vlad received a warm welcome. For that year, his uncle had become the ruler of Moldavia, and his cousin Stephen the heir apparent. And the 3 years that Vlad spent there, connecting with his cousin and getting a Renaissance education, were likely some of the happiest of his life. He even got a taste of military glory, helping his uncle and cousin turn back a Polish force. Good days. Though the time was abruptly cut short when his uncle's half-brother assassinated him, and Vlad and Stephen both fled to Hungary, where he was forced to play cat and mouse with John Hunyadi, going from town to town, hiding with sympathetic boyars, and at one point slipping away just as a squad of ambushers tried to catch and assassinate him. Then everything changed again. First, Sultan Murad died, and in his place rose his more vigorous and ambitious son Mehmed, who declared it his top priority to finally conquer Constantinople. A goal made possible since while the city was still a trade center and symbolically important, it had declined in military power. Hunyadi's star was falling as well. While he was still revered as the most famous crusader against the Turks, his 2 recent defeats had tarnished his reputation. I mean, a few years before, he'd essentially ruled Hungary on behalf of a child king, but now he was back to just being a plain old prince of Transylvania. And then Vladislav. Well, Vladislav was aligning ever closer with the Ottomans, meaning Hunyadi was suddenly shopping for a new which set up an interesting space for an approach between Hunyadi and Vlad. Because each did have something the other wasn't. Hunyadi could give Vlad legitimacy, official recognition in Hungary, and a path to reclaim his throne. And in turn, Vlad could give Hunyadi an able king who knew the Ottoman military and leadership from the inside, and who could replace Vladislav if necessary. Striking this deal, though, meant that Vlad would need to join the men. But in an ironic twist, Vlad's father of all people had prepared him for this decision, back when he'd abandoned Vlad as a hostage with the Ottomans. Politics was impersonal, and if reclaiming his throne meant foregoing vengeance, then so be it. Vlad became a noble at Hunyadi's court, and his new patron took him to the coronation of the new Hungarian king, Ladislaus the Posthumous, where he took an oath, formally, to act as an ally of Hungary and the Catholic Church. His role would be the same as— There goes your tower, watch it crumble, feel the power, everything goes in the game, no escape, no time to think your fate, there's no come on, there goes your tower, watch it crumble, feel the power, everything goes in the game, no escape, time to think your fate, there's no come on, there goes your tower. In front of the city walls, a punishment used by both Ottomans and German Saxons as a way to scare the garrison into surrendering. Believing the city would fall, and wanting to preserve his strength for defending his own territory, Hunyadi opted against sending troops to Constantinople. But he knew that Mehmed would not stop with the bastion of Eastern Christendom, and the next place on the chopping block was— There goes your tower, watch it crumble. So in 1456, he whipped up an army of mercenaries and marched to relieve the city, leaving Vlad to defend the pass into Transylvania and keep Vladislav tied down. Hunyadi's forces reached Belgrade just as the besieged city was ready to fall, broke through the Turkish lines, and managed to get inside the citadel to reinforce the beleaguered garrison. They broke the siege, repelling Mehmed's forces after weeks of combat. Hunyadi, the White Knight who had fought the Ottomans for decades, had relieved Belgrade, an event described as a miracle. But a miracle that went sour, as plague swept into his camp, killing Hunyadi and the expedition's other leader. But Vlad Dracula had little time to mourn the enemy-turned mentor, for his goal had been to tie up Vladislav's forces, and he knew the best way to do it: invasion. As he crossed into his homeland, he looked up to see a fell star burning in the heavens, Halley's Comet, a celestial body that people across the world interpreted as either a sign of impending catastrophe or great events. And meeting his enemy's army outside the Wallachian capital of Targovishta, Vlad took the burning star as a sign of coming victory. We know little about what happened next. According to one story, the relatively small armies clashed, but in another, the forces decided to settle the issue by single combat. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, against his cousin Vladislav, Prince of Wallachia. Though in both versions, Vlad slays the pretender with his own hand. When he took the throne, his coins were stamped with the five-tailed comet, the symbol of his victory. But that victory would be difficult to hold on to, because while he agreed to pay Mehmed 2,000 gold as tribute and agreed to let the Ottoman armies cross his lands, these agreements were only to buy time for him to build and repair more fortresses and solve internal problems at home. For the faction of boyars who had brought him to the throne were a small minority of the nobility. Most had supported the slain Vladislav, including those who had risen up and killed Vlad's brother at the prompting of John Hunyadi. Indeed, it was only months into his second reign when a young boyar raised an army of mercenaries to dethrone the young prince. But Vlad ambushed them as they marched towards Targovishta and made an example of them no one would miss. His troops sharpened long sticks, greased them, and then shoved them into the bodies of the noble and all his male kin. Then he left them, still living, beside the road to die over the coming days. Over time, he would refine this gruesome method of execution until history remembered him chiefly for the brutal spectacle. Vlad the Impaler had arrived, and his enemies would suffer. Targovishta, Easter 1457. The Wallachian boyars are feasting at Vlad Dracula's table. In their fine Easter clothes, they raise cups to their new prince. The past, they say, is forgotten. But Vlad does not forget. Suddenly, there's a commotion, and soldiers begin grabbing their arms. Vlad then separates the boyars and their families who had risen against his father and buried his brother alive, marching them out into the spring cold. The oldest are immediately impaled, while the others are force-marched down to a town below a ruined mountain fortress and told to pick up the freshly made bricks there. They will carry the bricks up the mountain, rebuilding the castle for the rest of their short lives. Their fine clothes carry them far away until they're nearly naked, and most work until they collapse and die. But who cares if the boyars perish from frostbite and exhaustion, huh? Vlad is the prince, and he can appoint new nobles. Now, if you watched the first two chapters of this video and thought, I thought this guy was called Vlad the Impaler, but he's hardly impaled anyone. Bring on the impaling! After this episode, you might regret that ask, because this part of the tale contains like a bajillion% more impalings and violence. Seriously, it's a lot. So please let this serve as a content warning for everything that follows, because this one's going to get brutal. But before we go there, I want to take a slight detour and talk about state violence during this era, since it's important to understanding Vlad, his times, and how he's remembered. The 15th century was a particularly one where there goes your cow. Few laws governed warfare, and rebellions often ended with massacres or mass executions. And it was common all over Europe to keep populations in line with displays of extreme violence, as this was an era of gory public executions and torture. English kings put heads on spikes, French ones broke people on the wheel, and the Spanish had the Inquisition. In other words, public displays of cruelty were a form of political communication. We say this not to excuse Vlad. Actually, if anything, it does the opposite, because even by these standards, there goes your tower. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. We don't have a lot of time in the game. No escape. Time to face your fate. There goes your power. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. which had been on the rise since the time of his grandfather. In fact, the instability of the Wallachian throne was not all due to outside interventions by Hungary and the Ottomans. It had as much, if not more, to do with the Wallachian boyars, who always tried to steer the weakest candidate to the throne and increase the power of their own council. Vlad, on the other hand, tended toward the aristocratic, centralized version of power that was on the rise in the Renaissance. In Vlad's mind, it would be he who controlled Wallachia, not the boyars and not the church. And the only way to keep the throne would be to become as powerful as possible. "You can judge for yourselves," he explained in a letter to the Transylvanian town of Brașov. "When a man or prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a strong man will come and do what he wants to him." His first act was to purge the boyars of any deemed unfaithful or ambitious, frequently executing them via impalement. Between 1457 and 1461, he replaced all but two boyars in his royal council, a body that rarely changed, even as the prince did, suggesting he likely surrounded himself with loyalists. Those loyalists came from a lower stratum of the boyars, while others were mercenaries or followers from his exile who owed their elevation directly to Vlad, and who often had no previous ties or allegiances in Wallachia. And the wealth and land that Vlad gave them had been provided by their predecessors, who didn't need it. He also instituted a campaign of terror in order to enforce public order. Now, we have to be cautious when discussing this, since first-hand records about his domestic massacres are lacking, and those written by outsiders, based on reports within the country, likely include some exaggerations. But even Romanian oral traditions that are kind to Vlad, casting him as tough but fair, still emphasize his extreme thieves were beheaded, unfaithful Romans skinned alive, lazy peasants impaled, Roman people forced into the military or boiled alive. A Romanian folktale tells of how he threw a banquet for beggars, then locked the doors and burned the hall down to stop them burdening the state. And several accounts discuss him impaling priests who did not show him suitable respect. In another story, two diplomats, in some versions representatives of the Ottomans, in others generally Italians, once said it was against their custom to remove either their turbans or skull caps before flying. So he supposedly honored this tradition by having their head coverings nailed to their skulls. And there goes your tower. They all share common elements. They portray a ruler who is trying to assert not only his own authority, but who wants to enforce a strict moral code, emphasizing hard work and deference to it. They also suggest a tendency to there goes your tower. But the massacres reached a new height in the Transylvanian town of Brașov. There goes your tower. Watch it from feel the power. Everything goes in the game. No escape. I'm trying to make a bait. There's no come on. There goes your tower. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. Everything goes in the game. No escape. Time to make your bait. Come on. There goes your tower. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. Everything goes in the game. No escape. Time to make your bait. Come on. There goes your tower. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. Everything goes in the game. No escape. Time to make your bait. Come on. There goes your tower. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. Everything goes in the game. When these Saxons recognized a third pretender, his patience ran out. He rounded up 41 Brașov merchants living in Wallachia and impaled them. Then he had 300 other Saxons burned alive, claiming that some were spies. Then he led a two-pronged attack into southern Transylvania, burning towns and attacking the outskirts of Brașov before withdrawing. This attack killed thousands and remains one of Vlad's most infamous acts. In retaliation, the Saxons of Brașov threw their full support behind another one of Vlad's relatives, Dan the Pretender, to make a try for the throne. And just from the fact that history remembers this guy as the Pretender, you can probably guess that did not go well. Captured after a brief battle, Dan supposedly knelt while his grave was dug in front of him, all the while a priest conducting a burial service while the terrified man was still alive. All of which climaxed when his executioner's axe fell, dropping the Pretender's head into an open pit. 3 years into his second reign, Vlad had, through utter brutality, achieved many of his goals. He terrorized the boyars into submission or replaced them, strengthening his power, and created a spectacle of gore so incredible that both pretenders to the throne and foreign enemies along the border would think twice about trying to unseat the son of the dragon. And so he turned to foreign policy, the Ottomans. Though Vlad started his reign by paying Mehmed financial tribute, that first payment was the only one he'd sent. And by 1461, he was 3 years past due, and Mehmed was looking for a meeting to clear up the diplomatic frostiness. The envoys of Mehmed came in force, a Greek diplomat and a Turkish commander at their head. They had planned to capture Vlad, much like Murad had captured Vlad's father. Instead, Vlad's army came out of hiding, surrounding the Turkish force. And upon marching them back to Targovishte, the Ottoman envoys beheld a stake erected for each of them, with 2 higher than the others, one for the Greek diplomat and one for the Turkish commander. Within weeks, Vlad's army was across the Danube River, ravaging Turkish territory, impaling thousands of prisoners, and burning civilians in their homes. Vlad was going to war against the Ottoman Empire, a clash that would prove a reunion, for leading the Turkish army against him was his childhood companion Mehmed, and at the Sultan's right hand, someone even closer to home, Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Oh boy. (1461), the Danube. Vlad Dracula puts pen to paper to tell his ally Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, about how many he has killed attacking Ottoman territory. 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians in all, not including those who were burned in their houses and whose heads were not presented to our officials. But he also writes, this will lead to an all-out war with Mehmed. When the weather permits, that is to say in the spring, they will come with evil intentions and with bold. And when they did, Vlad would find himself fighting alone. Vlad's attack on Ottoman territory across the Danube River didn't just come out of nowhere. He knew that his brother Rad was still on the Ottoman court, just in case Vlad needed to be replaced, and he was aware of Mehmed's expansionist designs. Indeed, it was obvious to everyone an attack was coming, because a few years earlier, Pope Pius II and the Venetians had raised money in order to fund a crusade that would prevent further Ottoman expansion. But while Matthias Corvinus, Frederick III, and other rulers had taken the Pope's money, because, free money, they were slow to actually do anything productive with it. Because while most European monarchs talked a big game about defending against the Muslim Turks, the reality was that for most kingdoms, their Christian neighbor states were a much more credible threat. In fact, in desperation, Pope Pius reached out to other Muslim states in hopes of convincing them.
There goes your tower, watch it crumble, feel the power,
namely his cousin Stephen, who he'd helped put on the throne of Moldavia. But now
there goes your tower, watch it crumble, feel the power, everything cool's in the game, no escape, time to face your fate, there's no, there goes your tower, watch it crumble, feel the power, everything cool's in the game, no escape, time to face your fate, there's no, there goes your tower, watch it crumble, feel the power, everything cool's in the game, no escape, time to face your fate, there's no,
after 10,000 soldiers in his main force, rather than professionals. Now, a word of caution here. While we do know what happened in this war, there's still a debate about the location, order of events, and even what Vlad and Mehmed's strategic objectives were. Mehmed, for his part, probably didn't want to outright conquer Wallachia and bring it into the empire. It was more valuable, after all, as a buffer zone against Hungary, but of course with the more dependable Radu in charge rather than Vlad. Also, he was interested in Stephen helping him take back a Black Sea fortress. Whereas Vlad, of course, wanted to stay on the throne and expel Mehmed from his lands. But he did know he couldn't beat Mehmed in the field, so instead, he used guerrilla tactics. He sent word for Wallachian civilians to flee to the Carpathian Mountains, then retreated, burning the land behind him and poisoning water sources to deny the Ottoman army food. Then, his horsemen harried Mehmed's column, striking and disappearing, occasionally taking captives, waiting for a moment to land a hard blow. Which came when the Ottoman army camped outside of the capital of Targovishte, not noticing that spies passed in their midst. According to folklore, one of those spies was in fact Vlad himself, using his command of Turkish to pass himself off as a soldier. And whether true or not, the scouts learned what they needed to know. the location of Mehmed's tent. Wallachian cavalry screamed into the unaware Ottoman force, slashing down with swords and burning canvas tents, killing hundreds in the shock assault before many in the Ottoman camp could even pick up weapons. And Vlad stormed through the melee, slicing his way into Mehmed's personal tent to find it empty. Mehmed happened to be somewhere else. Vlad called a retreat. His planned decapitation strike had failed. The next day, the armies finally met in earnest, where Vlad lost 2,000 soldiers and abandoned the capital to Mehmed, running with his shattered army for the safety of the mountains. But he left something behind. As Mehmed and Radu approached Targovishta, their troops saw what from a distance looked like a state of trees. That is, until they got closer. They were bodies. Ottoman captives.
There goes your tower. Watch it crumble. Feel the power. Everything goes in the game. No escape. Time to face your fate. There's no defeat.
Something in their corpses. One account puts the number at 20,000, roughly the amount Vlad himself had claimed to kill in his letter to Matthias Corvinus. But while this terror tactic did shake the as a more reasonable alternative to his vicious brother, even if he was an Ottoman puppet. Vlad was defeated, out of power, his troops likely deserting in increasing numbers. The only upside was that his fortress on the Black Sea had withstood a siege by both Stephen and Mehmed, but that was cold comfort. And within weeks, Vlad's support had melted to the point that Mehmed went home, leaving Radu to run things, secure on his new throne. Now hiding in the home. See, there was rumor that his whole house was so Vlad was now begging for peace. And Corvinus came with a pair of shadows. See, Corvinus didn't necessarily want to have a but the Venetian but he did have to show so he And no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, even Corvinus' court historian seems to think it was a little thin. But Corvinus needed to show the Pope a victory, and uncovering Vlad's treachery was a way to do that without expending his military. So Vlad was a prisoner once again, and would remain one for 14 years. We have little documentation on Vlad during this period, apart from the fact that he was held for a few years and then allowed to settle in a house in Pest, transitioning from being strictly a prisoner to more of an exiled noble, forbidden from leaving the country. Though among the few stories we have about him during this time is one violent incident involving Hungarian troops. Apparently, a thief had run and hid in Vlad's home, and Vlad had their leader executed on the spot. He'd argued, successfully, that he was within his rights because the troops had not asked for an invitation. Meanwhile, as Vlad stewed, causing a few diplomatic incidents in Pest, Radu lost the throne to another rival. And when the news hit a clearly restless Vlad, he pushed Corvinus to give him an army to recover Wallachia. Because remember, according to Corvinus, Vlad was still the legitimate prince, and Vlad argued he could be useful. But while Corvinus still refused for years to support Vlad, he did increasingly give his pet Wallachian prince a longer leash, letting him move against the Ottomans in Bosnia, and to bail Vlad's cousin Stephen out when his relationship with Mehmed soured and the Sultan invaded Moldavia, though it was only a prelude. Within months, a Hungarian army was marching on Targovishta, and Vlad and Stephen, armies now united, barely missed capturing the deposed prince as he fled to Mehmed. So in November 1476, Vlad once again became the Prince of Wallachia. In his life, he'd been a hostage of the Ottomans, Hungarians, Moldavians, a pope, and a sultan. Now in his mid-40s, it would be his third reign as prince. And though it would only last 2 months, Vlad would live forever. (1476), Constantinople. A messenger stands before Mehmed the Conqueror. He brings news of a victory against the tyrant Vlad III, who has massacred the faithful and spurned Mehmed's friendship. But the messenger didn't come alone. He carries a box, which upon its opening reveals the head of the treacherous, slain son of the dragon. Or at least that's what one story says. Because like many of the stories,
There goes your tower.
the account
Watch
of
it
how
crumble.
Vlad
Feel the
died
power.
far from victory.
Everything
We just know
goes in
that
the
2 months
game.
into his third reign, he fought a battle with the Ottomans and lost. In fact, it's kind of ironic that given all of the excruciating detail we have about how Vlad killed his foes, we know little about his own death. But death was not the end of Vlad Dracula. Because if there's one truth about human culture, it's this. When history doesn't provide a fitting end to a historical life, legends will step in to finish the job. And Dracula refused to stay in the ring. Despite his relatively brief time on the throne of Wallachia, less than 7 years in total, at the time of Vlad Dracula's death, he was already casting an outsized shadow over his life. For instance, do you remember back in episode 3 when we talked about the parade of cruelty and massacre during Vlad's second reign? Well, one of those incidents that might have gotten lost in the sheer cacophony of awfulness was Vlad's massacre of Transylvanian Saxons, an act that had see, those Saxons were Greek, and while they had come to the area a couple of centuries before, they still had family and trade ties with their homeland, which in the mid to late 15th century was one of Europe's greatest centers of printing and publishing. Now, many early books and pamphlets printed in Europe essentially functioned as political and religious propaganda. And after his massacres of Saxons in Brajov, Saxon printers made Vlad a favorite villain in their printings. Meaning, as Vlad cooled his heels as a captive in Hungary, he was becoming internationally famous for cruelty and butchery, a portrayal that only escalated after his death. Now, it's important to note that many of these stories printed about Vlad were exaggerated, and a bunch likely not true at all. In fact, we've been very careful to not draw on them too much as sources, and label said sources appropriately in the rare times that we do. Because while this genre of writing was originally intended to smear one's enemies, it also became a sort of early horror literature. Even as far back as the 15th and 16th centuries, the general rule for publications was, if it bleeds, it leads. Meaning, stories of blood and guts sold well, particularly if they came along with gruesome woodblock prints. Even ostensibly serious religious books, like the 1563 publication Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, would get spiced up with lurid scenes of Protestants getting tortured or burned at the stake. Also, Catholic art and publications had a similar fascination with violent imagery, and the existing stories about Vlad served as a perfect jumping-off point for German authors to create stories about him doing, well, basically any twisted thing they could imagine. The Ottomans, similarly, were happy to preserve stories about Vlad's awfulness since it justified removing him and made Hungary look bad for supporting him. Early biographers also played a part in this mythologizing, though sometimes to Vlad's benefit. For example, a Greek biographer who appreciated Vlad's years fighting the Ottoman Empire while acknowledging Vlad's cruelty also went out of his way to try and discredit him. This includes claims that Vlad converted to Islam, which is debatable, and that he and Mehmed were actually taken. A portrayal historians also find suspect, since it only exists in one very anti-Ottoman source. But before you come at us, all you Mehmed Radu stands, we're not saying this wasn't a thing, just that it's not a totally established fact. Ooh, but you know what is a fact? Until this very series, Rob didn't know that people actually ship historical figures. But now you can't unknow it. Anyway, one important thing to consider is that despite all of the things said about Vlad, he was never, in any sense, accused of being a villain. That was the work of Irish writer Bram Stoker, who ran across the accounts of Vlad as he prepared to write a vampire novel that was very Romanian focused, with 19th century technology and medical tools. Now exactly how much inspiration Stoker took from Vlad has been hotly debated among historians. There are those who argue that he did extensive research on Romania, its folklore, and its history. Libraries used have discovered margin notes in books on the subject, and Jonathan Harper's journey into the Carpathian Mountains is prominent in its descriptions of routes, terrain, and even some local beliefs. Also in the novel, Stoker's Dracula even talks about raiding across the Danube and fighting the Ottomans in his life. But then the discovery of Stoker's notes in the 1970s turned a lot of these theories on their heads. Now, historians generally agree that Stoker knew little of Romania and essentially copied Harker's route and descriptions of the countryside from a 19th century travel guide. His description of Dracula
There goes your tower.
was flawed
Watch
at
it.
all, and he drew upon previous English vampire novels as much as Romania.
There goes your tower.
His notes
Watch it
of fact
crumble.
don't
Feel the power. Everything goes in
They
the
do,
game.
however,
No escape.
very excited
Time to
about
face
the
your
fact
fate.
that several
There's no-
myths
there's
were
no-
from a family
there's no
line
debate.
called Dracula.
There goes your
So
tower.
excited
Watch it
that in
crumble.
his
Feel
notes
the
he
power.
actually draws
Everything
Dracula
goes in
and
the
Wallachia
game. No
means
escape.
devil, with Dracula
Time to face
and
your fate.
devil in all
There's no-
caps.
there's
In
no-
other words,
there's
it's
no
probably
debate.
just like today.
There goes your tower. Watch it crumble.
Which actually was understandable, because by the 19th century, the word for devil and dragon had become interchangeable in Romanian. Plus, the local folklore of the time had forgotten the Order of the Dragon connection, claiming that Vlad was called Dracula for his cruelty. But even though his knowledge on the references he drew from and translation of the name of its title character is flawed, let's also try to remember that Stoker originally named his vampire Count Wampir and titled the book simply The Undead. I know, Zoe, I wouldn't watch Christopher Lee in that either. So that's how the outside world knew Vlad the Impaler. From Stoker's moderately successful novel, to blockbuster play, television and film adaptations, to Halloween costumes, games, and a whole tourism industry in Romania centered around Dracula's castle. A castle that Vlad probably never visited, and that Bram Stoker never saw. But don't let that stop you from going, actually, because it's still a pretty freaking cool castle. But that international fame is only half the story. Because while everyone outside Romania saw Vlad as either a psychopath or blood-drinking Victorian monster, Romania itself had its own view. To speak very broadly, in the century after Vlad's death, Wallachia and Moldavia became Ottoman tributary states, whereas Transylvania remained independent for 2 centuries before falling under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At times, between 2 and 3 of the kingdoms shared the same monarch, drawing them closer together. Then by the 19th century, the 3 had enough of a shared sense of identity that they launched a series of simultaneous rebellions with the goal of independence. Finally, in 1878, in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, Wallachia and Moldavia united to form Romania and later added Transylvania after World War I. And a core component of 19th century nationalism was drawing historical heroes out from history. And at a time when Wallachia and Moldavia were struggling for independence from Ottoman rule, Vlad the Impaler fit the mold of a hero that spoke to the present issue. In Romania, he was seen as a brutal but fair ruler who kept Wallachia independent for a time and died defending his land from greater powers. Now, if you've watched all this series, you've probably concluded that Vlad cared more about gaining and keeping personal power than any noble cause. But as is often the case with nationalistic heroes, this was ignored in favor of a story that fit more neatly with 19th century Romanian politics. The image of Vlad as an independence fighter, doing what had to be done to keep his kingdom independent from the Ottomans, just felt true at the time, and turned Vlad into a national symbol. Though to be fair, even though Vlad remains a celebrated figure in modern Romania, many Romanians continue to debate over whether the country should really be proud of him. Who'd have thunk it? This stuff's complicated. But all of these disparate opinions of Vlad's story only served to make it more interesting. From a life that was messy, often confusing, and of, let's just say, ambiguous loyalties, later writers have crafted Vlad into everything from a nationalist icon, to horror character, to folklore figure, to literary vampire, and to bait for tourist traps. Meaning, he's a fascinating study in how, if you're famous enough, one day you may end up rising from your grave to become something else entirely. Which makes you want to take a good look in the mirror, doesn't it? And more department, you could take the gas on your own. And then go check out Nebula because their stuff is to die for. This slimy. Now it's like, it is no secret by now that we are super proud of Nebula, our creator-owned operated streaming service, where you can see all of our extra history videos available there early, meaning you can watch the first episode of our Nazi occultism series right now before you can see it anywhere else. Plus, every show from Nebula from its over 200 creators are always ad-free. And Nebula is home to a ton of other creator-led prestige originals. Just in time for spooky season, for instance, there's this new film, Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend from Philosophy Tube, and Star Wars and House of the Dragons, Abigail Thorne, that just got its fangs into me. It's so good. And I'm also happy to report that the complete season of my travel game show of Subterfuge and Deception, The Getaway, is now available for you to binge. Ooh, and this just in, Rift Tracks is now on Nebula, meaning you get to join the OG crew from Mystery Science Theater 3000 as they make movies just way more fun. I am incredibly excited about this. I've been fans of these guys for as long as I can remember being a fan of anything, and if you haven't actually seen a Rift Tracks movie before, a perfect place to start this season is their take on Night of the Living Dead. They will get you, even if your name is not Barbara. You can see that and everything else Nebula has to offer for just $3 a month when you sign up for one of our annual plans, or you can snag a Nebula gift card for a friend, or even a lifetime membership that will last for as long as both you and Nebula exist. No tricks, no gimmicks, just